He put a curse on the woman, put a curse on the man. The man's going to have to work, you know, with his hands. The woman's going to have to suffer pain in childbirth. He put all this curse. He put thorns and thistles, right? Now he's placing a curse on the serpent. He said that the serpent, that one day a Messiah was going to come and he's going to bruise you on the head, right? So that Messiah ended up being Jesus Christ. Now, why is that critical? Because as we begin to move forward, we're going to see in a minute why that's so important, because then God had to implement a plan in order to bring Genesis 3:15 to pass.
Amen. Amen.
All right? So in other words, when Jesus didn't just pop up one day in Mary's womb, it didn't happen that way. God put together a systematic plan that lasted over 2,000 years. Then he began to systematically put things into place to open up the door to make the way for Jesus to be born on earth. All right? And this systematic plan is what's recorded in the 11 foundational books. So in other words, these 11 foundational books that I pointed out are the building blocks of the Old Testament. Everything is centered around these 11 foundational books, and everything that happens can be traced through these 11 foundational books. So if we jump ahead to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. And of course I'm skipping over 2,000 years of history. I'm skipping over 2,000 years of history because from Genesis chapter 1 through verse 11, we're looking at about 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, let me just put a pin right there and just go back and just reiterate something. If you were teaching this in a full-blown class, there's a lot more that you can unpack. For an example, when you do this in a full-blown scholarly type of setting, that you get into the various discussions about creation, and there's all the various theories about creation, which I don't have time to really go into, and you get into the various theories like theistic evolution. How many are familiar with these terms? You know, all of us heard about evolution, and you got theistic evolution, you have all these different terms, the gap theory, you know, it's the 7 literal days. You get into all that, which I don't have time to unpack any of that right now, but just understand that as you go through then we all know the flood story, we know the Tower of Babel story, which the Tower of Babel story, I don't think people really have ever unpacked it the way that it really occurred, but I don't have time to do that right now, but we all want to jump ahead to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. If Genesis 3 and 15 is the cornerstone verse, then Genesis chapter 12 is the cornerstone chapter in the Bible. It's the cornerstone chapter in the Bible because it is here in Genesis chapter 12 where God begins to unfold his plan to bring Genesis 3:15 to pass. It is beginning here in Genesis chapter 12 where God begins to unfold his plan to bring Genesis chapter 3 and 15 to pass. In other words, as we look back at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God says that basically what he was saying is that man has fallen, I'm going to institute a plan of redemption that will bring man eventually back into right fellowship with me and bring the world back to the state that it was prior to the fall. Basically, all that was recorded in Genesis 3:15. Now, here's the kicker, that Adam and Eve no doubt had no idea what God was talking about when he said what he said in Genesis 3:15. But the serpent almost certainly knew exactly what God was talking about. He almost certainly knew. And so from this point on, the serpent set out to try to block God's plan. So here we see this narrative. Now, so if you keep that principle in mind, and then if you keep the battle of the warfare, battle of the mind, things that we talked about throughout, if you keep those two principles in mind and track those principles as you study through the Old Testament, you can see the connection. Because God was unfolding his plan, and the serpent was trying to block God's plan. And basically, you can write this down, the serpent has basically two objectives. Two objectives. To defeat God's plan and to deceive God's people. To defeat God's plan and to deceive God's people. Now let's back up again, and we say that if Genesis chapter 3 and 15 is the cornerstone verse, Genesis chapter 12 is the cornerstone chapter. And let's look at Genesis chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. Underline that, a great nation. Underline that. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse. And in all the families of the earth will be blessed. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Right? So here we begin to see the first mention of what we call the Abrahamic Covenant. And it was here at this Abrahamic Covenant where God began to launch his plan to fulfill Genesis 3:15. Does that put it in perspective? Mm-hmm. It is here in Genesis chapter 12 that God begins to initiate, that's a better word, that God begins to initiate his plan to bring Genesis 3:15 to pass. In other words, his ultimate objective is going to be bring man back in, and the earth, by the way, back into the right relationship with God the way it was prior to the fall. So basically, from here on, we're going to see God beginning to unfold and unpack his plan. 12 is the beginning of what we call the Abrahamic Covenant. The Abrahamic Covenant. The Abrahamic Covenant was a covenant that God made with this man by the name of Abraham. That through his loin, through his generation, through his progeny, that the Messiah that was promised in Genesis 3:15 is going to be birthed through your bloodline. Okay? So, God had to raise up a man. Now, remind you, at the beginning of this, notice some of the things that was being recorded in this verse. He said, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. Now, remember, he's 80 years old. Okay? His wife was, no, he's 90. He's 90. His wife is 80. And they had no children. Now, imagine that. Now, think about that. They was old. They was ancient. And didn't have no children, but yet God made a promise and said, your kid, your progeny is going to be like the sand of the sea and the stars, and all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. Now, you know they had to be tripping over that. Okay? But to fast forward, God actually miraculously used this man to start a generation that ultimately and eventually led to the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, in this particular class, this particular narrative, though, what we try to focus on is the fact that from this point on, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, God began to deal almost exclusively from this point on all the way through Malachi. He begins to deal exclusively with the nation of Israel. He deals exclusively with the nation of Israel. Now, during the course of the rest of the Old Testament, which again, keep in mind, these 11 foundational books is what we're talking about. The 11 foundational books. Through these 11 foundational books, we can see how the different periods transpired in Israel's history. So in other words, in Israel's history, there were 7 periods. 7 periods that took place during Israel's history. And I won't have time just this morning in order to deal with all of them. But I'm going to just share with you what those 7 periods were. And then we'll just go back and see how many of them we can actually get into. But there's 7 periods, beginning at Genesis chapter 3. I'm sorry, beginning at Genesis chapter 12, all the way through Malachi, there were 7 periods in Israel's history. Period number 1 we call the formation period. The formation period. Period number 2 is called the theocracy period. Period number 3 was called the united monarchy period. Period number 4 was the divided monarchy period. Period number 5, the single monarchy period. Period number 6 is the the captivity period, and then the restoration period, and period number 7. These periods are highlighted in the 11 foundational books. That's why it's important to, if you study, I just want to make this challenge to everybody. If you study these 11 books, your understanding of the Old Testament will be like, we might even have some Old Testament scholars in the room already. But I don't know if any of my scholarly friends have ever actually studied the Old Testament exclusively through the course of the 11 foundational books. Because you get a bigger and a better picture of everything that goes on in the Old Testament when you just study these 11. Let me just throw this in real quick. Is that we're going to just go back. Remember the balance of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about these 7 periods. We're going to talk about these 7 periods. And these 7 periods are highlighted in the 11 foundational books and make up the big picture of the Old Testament. Everybody say big picture.
Big picture.
This makes up the big picture of the Old Testament. Remember we showed the puzzle, the picture on the box? This is what when God looks down at it, he sees the big picture. He doesn't see the individual little pieces. So what we want to do is teach this from the standpoint of how God sees it versus how we see it as opposed to just a lot of little pieces. And when God looks at it, he sees the big picture. And we want to go back and we start the first part, and we want to unpack with the first period, and which most people never really look at it like this. But remember, when we start out, we just got Abraham and Sarah. That's it. You don't have a nation, right? So it starts out the first period with stand to reason. That means you have to have a formation period, right? So in other words, God has to, before he can do anything else, he has to form a nation. That's the reason why we call the first period the formation period. Now, in order to have a nation, what are 3 things you got to have?
People, land, law.
And the laws. Everybody unpack that. All right. Everybody, think about that. You got to have, in order to have a nation, you got to have 3 things. You got to have 3 building blocks in order to have a nation. You got to have people, you got to have a law code, and then you have to have land to call your own.